you ever had that one of those moments where as you're doing something, you're thinking to yourself, what in the world am I doing? Why am I doing this? Or even, this could turn out really, really badly for me. This wasn't one of those drastic situations, but this week I was looking in my sort of library nook in my office for a prop that I thought I had, and I thought it was on the very top shelf, and I got my office chair, and I rolled it over, right? And so I am standing on my office chair doing one of these deals, thinking what am I doing? What am I doing in here? They're going to hear a crash. I'm going to be lying on the floor. And I started to think to myself as I was reading this end portion of Paul's letter to the Philippians, I think a lot of people live life in sort of a unstable ground type of situation. Have you ever found yourself in one of those moments? And here's the hard part about them, is that we figure out that we're standing on unstable ground when the storms of life hit. Jesus tells this parable in Matthew chapter 7 at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. And he says to his disciples who are there listening to him, he says there's two ways to live your life. There's one way, and it's to build your life on the words that I've just said. And so if you go back and you read Matthew chapter 5 through 7, you see Jesus inviting followers of his to a completely different way of living. To a way of living where instead of harboring anger, we release it. Instead of hating our enemies, we pray for them and we love them. Instead of lusting after people and things, we surrender that to God. And Jesus says, listen, you have two ways to live. You can live and build your life on those words of mine. And when you do that, when the storms of life come, you are going to stand firm. See, they're going to beat against your life, the storms of life will. They're going to push against you. The waves are going to come. The floods are going to rise. And if you're standing on his words, Jesus says, you will stand firm. He also says, listen, the storms are coming in every single life. So if you're here this morning, that's awkward. Stop. If you're here this morning, I was praying I'd make it all the way around, and I didn't. You just have to know. Okay, sorry. You just have to know. The storms have either come or they're coming. And they will always question your foundation. And what will determine whether or not your life continues to flourish and your life continues to stand is not how moral and how good you are. It's not how many things you've done in your past and what your resume looks like or what your bank account looks like. What will determine whether or not you continue to stand is what you're standing on. And so at the end of the letter of Philippians, Paul's just pouring out his heart to this church that he dearly and deeply loves. And listen to what he tells them. Now remember, if you've been with us over the last 10 weeks, we've been studying this letter that this guy named Paul, the Apostle Paul, wrote to a church that he planted about 12 years earlier. And as he's writing this letter, he's sitting in a Roman house on house arrest. And he doesn't know at this point whether or not he's going to keep his life or whether he's going to lose it for the gospel. But he writes back to this church in Philippi to encourage them, to build into them, and to remind them that there is a foundation that even if he loses his life, will not fail him. And listen to what he says. He says, therefore, my brothers, and could be my brothers and my sisters, whom I love, whom I long for, my joy and my crown. Say it with me, church. Stand firm in the Lord. Stand firm, and it's not just, hey, try your best when the storms of life come to stand firm. He actually tells us how we stand firm. It's the same thing that Jesus taught. Stand firm where? In the Lord, right? In the Lord. Because the ground that you are standing on will determine if your house continues to stand when the storms of life come. And so what Paul would say to every single one of his listeners in the original audience, and what he'd say to us too, is this, is if you want to live a life that's unshakable, You've got to live a life that's grounded in the immovable. Unless we want, when the storms of life come, to sort of be in that place of feeling like the ground is giving out on us and we're drifting and things are just beating against our life and it has the potential to ruin us. And Paul goes, no. Build your life on something that will last. Build your life on something that has staying power. Stand firm in him, in the Lord, because an unshakable life is grounded in an immovable God. Okay, so here's what Paul does from here. He gives us this great challenge, this great invitation that right in front of you is the work of Jesus, his grace that's available, and you have the ability as followers of his to say, that's going to be the cornerstone of my life. That's going to be the foundation of my life. And so what Paul wants to do in the rest of this section of the letter is say, when that's a reality for you, it opens up all sorts of possibilities for the way that you'd interact with the people around you. Because if you're grounded in the immovable one, you're able to address life, to walk through challenging situations in a completely different way. So Paul wants to say, hey, if you are standing firm in Jesus, you can change the way that you interact with the people around you. Your relationships can change if you're grounded in him. If you're grounded in him, the way that your heart approaches life can change. The things that you fear can change if you're grounded in him. And the way that you think, if you're unshakable in the immovable one, the way that you think can be completely different. But it's what we're standing on that determines our approach to the life that we live. And so listen to what he says. After he gives them that encouragement to stand firm, listen to what he says. Can you go to the next slide? I'm thinking that sign might mean no. Okay, no, not that one. Philippians chapter 2. If you have a Bible, and I hope you do, will you open it? Philippians chapter 4, verse 2. Chapter 4, verse 2. It says this. Oh, it's up there for you if you need it. Paul writes, I entreat Euodia and I entreat Syntyche to agree in the Lord. Okay, now quick time out. So how would it feel to get called out in a letter that ends up being read for a few thousand years? I mean, this is bordering on a little bit of public shaming, but you see this pastor's heart in Paul. He's like, come on, entreat them. Because they stand firm in the Lord, beg them, plead with them, challenge them to agree in the Lord. Yes, I ask you also, true companion, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are written in the book of life. And he's saying this, hey, because you ladies stand firm, because you're grounded in the work of Jesus, you don't have to continue to walk through life at odds with other people. The foundation you have in Christ frees you to operate differently in relationships than anybody else has the capacity to do. So step into that awkward place. Step into that challenging place. Step into that place of doubt and into the unknown and pursue unity deliberately. Aren't you glad as a culture that we've got this one nailed? So I'm studying this week, and you may have heard there was an election. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, I have never felt the visceral sense of division in our country like I feel it right now. And that doesn't mean that it hasn't been there. It just means that it's on the surface. And it means that as a church, we're going to need to deal with that. And friends, will you look up at me for a second? The way that we deal with this is not by lobbing grenades onto those outside of us. It's by setting an example of a better way within us. And so here's the beautiful thing about being part of a church, you guys. There are people sitting in your row who voted differently than you. And that, maybe, unless your whole family's there and you're going, hey, who's in my row? Who is it? Section, in your section. Okay. And here's what we need to do as a body of Christ. One, we need to listen really well. And we need to listen without casting judgment, and we need to hear people's hearts. We need to hear their fears. We need to hear their joys. We need to hear their disappointments. And then we need to come back together, and we need to remind ourselves of what brings us together. And hey, here's the thing. No president in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is called to unite the church. Jesus is. And so as followers of Christ, with people who voted differently, who have different political opinions, what a beautiful picture it is to link arms and say, oh man, hey, we stand on him, and so we can pursue unity with people who think a little bit differently than us, with a ferocious tenacity, because we believe that there's a better way. And so here's what Paul does. He doesn't just leave them there. He doesn't just go, hey, ladies, pursue unity. You need to really make amends. He gives them resources. He says, hey, there's things available to you. If you go back and you look and you read in Philippians chapter 4, he says, yes, and I ask also, true companion, help these women. So he's going, hey, there's somebody in your body. There's somebody in the church that if there's a division, they can probably help you work through it. We could say, and if this is something you're wrestling through, man, these are pastors. These are counselors. We believe in really good Christian counseling here that can help people work through things. It's maybe a mediator, but Paul says it's available to you. Use the resources that are there. That's that important. Second thing he says, he's not just, hey, try really hard. No, there's resources out there for you. And remember, you guys have labored side by side for the gospel. And isn't it true that when we start getting pressed down by division, we forget the mission that's in front of us? And so Paul just goes, hey, come on. I know you ladies, something happened and there's a division amongst you, but will you just take a moment and remember the mission in front of you? Will you remember why you're together in the first place? And then finally he says, and your names are written in the book of life, as if to say you're going to spend all of eternity together. You might want to figure out how to get along now. That's his message. Pursue unity with deliberate intention because Jesus is worth it. And I don't know where you're at with that and how that sits on you today, but I'm guessing that in every single life in this room, there's a place where we could have God speak to us over this area. And I would say back to us, one of the main ways the enemy works in the lives of believers is by causing what we would call a root of bitterness to grow up. In fact, Paul will say to the church at Ephesus, be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger and give no opportunity or give no foothold to the devil. What's he talking about? Well, he's saying, hey, if there's things unresolved that start to cause anger in your soul, that you're unwilling to forgive, the enemy's going to get a foothold in your life and potentially start to wreak havoc. That's his message. You know, one of the best weapons against spiritual warfare is forgiveness. The enemy hates when you forgive an audacious sin because he has no place in your life. So for you, what might it be today? I mean, luckily, none of us are called out, right, in the scriptures personally like they were. But as we read it, we have to go, all right, Lord, who do I need to make a phone call to this week? Who do I need to humble myself, swallow my pride, and apologize to? Who do I need to reach out to and say, hey, let's have a conversation? See, when you stand firm in the Lord, you're able to navigate relationships differently. The second thing you're able to do differently, verse 4. Paul writes this. He says, rejoice in the Lord always. Okay, if you've been here over 10 weeks, you're going, oh, Paulson, are we going here again? I mean, the series is called Happy. You've taught on joy almost every week. I'm not going there explicitly. I just want to point out it's in there, okay? I will say it again, rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, supplication, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will, not might, will guard your heart and mind in Christ Jesus. How many love that passage? Oh man, that's a tattoo passage right there. That's a good one. Because then when you start worrying, you can be like, oh yeah, right, that's right. This word anxiety in the Greek literally means to be torn into parts. It's the picture of horses running in the opposite directions. And so for maybe you, it's both fear and hope that are present, and they're just going in different directions in your life. Maybe it's a situation that you have in your mind right now, and you don't know how it's going to turn out, and you don't know exactly where that road is going to lead. And anxiety just plays like a tape in the back of our minds. And sometimes we don't even know it's there. We just know that we wake up in the morning and our jaw hurts, right? Or we've gone through the day and our fists are clenched, and we don't know exactly why, but we do know that there's something off in our soul. There's a part of Paul's command that's horribly unhelpful. I mean, if he would have just stopped and said, don't be anxious about anything. Good luck with that, amen, right? Because we all know that as hard as we try to not be anxious about anything, there's things that we're anxious about. There's things that we have fears of. And every single person in this room is wired a little bit differently. And there's things that we have unique fear towards or anxiety towards. One author said that anxiety is like sitting in a rocking chair. You exert a lot of energy and you go nowhere. It's true. It's true. And you're all wired differently. In 1961, there was this psychologist named Fritz Riemann, and he had this theory that each person who walks the face of the globe has probably a core anxiety or a core fear. Some people, they fear nearness, so they fear intimacy. So when people start to get close to them, they build walls, and they say, in no uncertain terms, maybe not overtly or explicitly, but you can't get any closer to me than this. Don't point at anyone. It's going to make them feel bad. It's just, yeah. Second is fear of distance. It's sort of the other side of that coin. It's that fear of being alone. It leads us to places of potentially codependency and, oh man, I need you in a really unhealthy way. He says the next sort of core anxiety that people face is the fear of change. So if that's you, control is a huge priority to you. That you want to make sure everything around your life is stable and unchanging, because if it does, fear or anxiety starts to rise up in your soul. Or the other side of that coin is the fear of permanence. You've probably had a few different jobs in the last year. Okay? And it's hard for you to finish a project that you start. And adventure is on the horizon, and heaven forbid you are prevented from walking into it. See, here's the thing. There is extreme value in being self-aware to the point where you can go, all right, so this is me. This is who I am. I love being in control. And when I get out of control, I start to get on unshaky ground. So God, teach me how. Teach me how to ground myself in you in such a way that even when the winds come and the storms rage and the floods happen, I don't revert back to spaces of fear in my life, but that I continue to charge forward after you. See, here's Paul's encouragement to the church. His encouragement is, okay, there's resources for you. Combat that fear that you sense rising up in your soul prayerfully. It's interesting that this word to not have anxiety is a present imperative command. So it's this idea that not sort of pray and deal with fear, and that's not Paul's encouragement to us. It's, hey, every day you're probably going to have to deal with this. And when you find yourself carrying anxiety, and when you find yourself carrying fear, you've got to be disciplined enough and stand to the Lord to say, all right, that's not how I want to live. That's not who I'm going to be. I'm going to let that go. It's not a one-time decision. It's a continual ethic of this is how I live as a follower of Jesus. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I'm a child of the Most High God. And so Paul says, okay, here's the way that you deal with it. You deal with it prayerfully, and we'll get there in just a second. But before that, in verse 4, he says, rejoice in the Lord always. Did you know it's really hard to be anxious when you're rejoicing? Have you ever tried that? I mean, we should have signs that say to anxiety, beware of rejoicing. Because you have no place in my life getting torn apart, anxiety, if I'm rejoicing in the Lord. And so Paul says, hey, make that an ethic of your life. The second thing he says in this passage is, and God is near. The Lord is at hand. And so, whatever it is for you that causes anxiety, maybe it was the election that was going on, maybe it's your neighbor, maybe it's your marriage, maybe it's your kids or your health or whatever. Whatever it is that triggers our anxiety, we also have to trigger ourselves to say, God, in the midst of all that's going on around me, I need to remember that you're with me. Because when I'm anxious, I'm really just unaware. I'm unaware that God holds us all together. I'm unaware that he's good. I'm unaware that he loves me. And so the psalmist will say, the Lord is near to all who call upon him, to all who call on him in truth. And finally, Paul says, the way we deal with anxiety is through joy, is through awareness of God's presence with us, but in everything, he says, with prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving. So here's the process that Paul just went through. He said, when anxiety starts to take root in your soul, when you feel the inner parts of you getting torn in different directions, go to God in prayer, and supplication means we ask God for what we feel like we need. And so he goes, ask him, cry out to him. And secondly, don't forget this part, thank him. Because I am often, in anxiety, I get totally unaware of the way that God has blessed me and the way that his hand's at work. And so part of the discipline of following Jesus and becoming a disciple is learning to use those triggers of anxiety in our life to lead us to places of prayer. Because as hard as it is to be joyful and anxious, it's equally as hard to be prayerful and anxious. Try it. Peter would say in his letter to the churches, he says, and casting all of your anxieties on him, on God, because he cares for you. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7. You see, you can cast your worry or you can carry your worry, but you can't do both. Either you carry it or he does. And so if you're an anxious person, if that's sort of just in your disposition, or maybe you're walking through a season of anxiety, can I invite you? This idea of casting would literally be like throwing a stone into the water. It's just, get this off of me. Back to the Lord. And maybe today's a day that you do that. Paul finishes this up with a promise. He says, and if you're anxious about anything, pray Ask God, thank God, let your request to be known to God, and then God will do exactly what you want. I mean, wouldn't it be great if that's the way the passage ended? Like this little equation that as followers of Christ, we all want it to be, right? And that's not the way it goes at all. It's let your request be known to God, and God's promise back to you isn't, I'm a genie in a bottle and I'll do exactly whatever you want, however you want, whenever you want. God's promise back to you is, I will give you my peace that surpasses any understanding that you could ever dream of having. Which means, you might still not understand why you're walking through what you're walking through. And you might not have all the answers, but there will be an anchor in your soul to say, in the midst of the questions, I am unshakable in the immovable. This word peace in the Greek, it has this idea of bringing the pieces back together into a whole. So, if you look at the sort of the word anxiety, which is division, and peace, which is a bringing it back together, God says, okay, everything you're walking through, every fear that you have, the anxieties that you have, all the things swirling around in your life, if you're willing to hand it to me, I will be bigger than it all, and in some way, I will bring it back together in your life. I'll give you peace, wholeness. The Hebrew people of God would call this the shalom, the healing of God. So as you're walking through life right now, maybe there's an issue relationally, but maybe there's an issue of your heart, because that's what's going on in this passage. This is a heart issue. Anxiety is a heart issue. Is there anything that you need to just bring to the Lord and say, God, here it is. I'm not going to try to hide it from you. You're God, okay? But I need your peace. Well, what might that look like for you? Dietrich Bonhoeffer in 1945 was walking to his death, and he knew it. It was 3 days before the Nazi prison camp that he was in would be freed. One of the greatest, in my opinion, greatest theologians of the 20th century. And as he's walking to his death, he turns to a friend and says, "This is the end. But for me, just the beginning." How can he do that? I mean, somehow this guy is unshakable in the immovable, and he is going. Do you think he's anxious? He's human. He's walking to his death. Oh, I mean, yes. Did it control him? No. Did he cast it? Yes. Did he get God's peace? Oh, for me, this is the end, but for me, this is the beginning. And if you've ever been around somebody who knew Jesus and who was facing death, you've seen the type of peace that surpasses any understanding. Anybody want to say yes? Yeah, absolutely. And friends, you don't just have to have it as you face death. You can have it as you walk through life. Here's the way Paul ends this section. He says this, "Finally, brothers," which is the second time he said finally in this letter. He said it in chapter 3, verse 1. He's a preacher. He's landing the plane, right? The word could also mean, and in addition to this, or also. So, finally, brothers, whatever is true, and whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's anything excellent, if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. I can remember being in church as a middle schooler and high schooler, and I can remember reading this passage and going, man, that's so narrow. Like, we're only supposed to think about, I read it, now, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is noble. Think about these things. I read it completely different now. Now I read it, whatever is true, whatever's noble, whatever's lovely, whatever is beautiful, whatever is good, think about these things. In the Greek, it's this word, not like think as in let it pass through your brain, but sink an anchor into it. Camp out there for a while. Some translations will say dwell on it or meditate on it or take it into your life. Now, the really fascinating part about this is what Paul just did. He draws out these 6 characteristics that were Hellenistic or Greek virtues. So they were not unique or distinctive of just the people of God. In fact, just the opposite. They were cultural virtues that Paul looks at and goes, these are really good things. And whatever's good, whatever's noble, whatever's pure, as if to say that every good thing is owned by our great God. And so we don't have to limit ourselves when it comes to being followers of Christ to just sing Christian songs to worship God. Like we can, whatever's beautiful can point us back to him. Paul is this beautiful, wonderful, absolutely astounding cultural architect where he's going, hey, as you walk through Philippi, you are a citizen of the kingdom of heaven, but as a citizen of the kingdom of heaven, every good thing is yours. So what around you do you see that's good? What around you do you see that's beautiful? Think about those things. Dwell on those things. Take those things in. And he wants to encourage them, hey, focus your thinking intentionally. So pursue unity deliberately. Yeah, absolutely. Combat anxiety prayerfully. Yeah. And then focus your thinking intentionally. You are in complete control of your thoughts. 100%. Have you ever thought about what you're thinking? Have you ever step back and go, all right, where am I going with that? And why am I thinking that? And why am I going down that road? Ralph Waldo Emerson said, you sow a thought, reap an action. Sow an action, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap character. Sow character and reap a destiny, as if to say this will determine the course of your life. The great theologian, pastor, and preacher Jonathan Edwards said it like this. He said, the ideas and images in men's minds are the invisible powers that constantly govern them. So as we stand firm in the Lord, we're able, Paul says, to change the way that we think. Instead of allowing things like despair and cynicism and fatalism to occupy our lives, as followers of Jesus, we can think differently about the world that we live in. Hey, here's the thing. Look up at me for a second. You cannot change the world that you live in, but you can change the way you live in the world. And so as followers of Jesus, what if we became the type of people who, instead of just judging everything outside of the church or outside of our pocket of faith, if we took the things that we saw as beautiful, good, noble, pure, praiseworthy, and we just said, I just want to put a magnifying glass on those, because whatever you magnify in your life, you will multiply. Whatever you put your focus on, you'll start to see more of in your life. It's just going to come out of you. And the Apostle Paul wants us to be the type of people who see and appreciate and think about good. So here's just 2 examples. 4 examples. Okay. I think music's a great example. Like, have you ever just put on a piece of just classical music or whatever floats your boat, right? And just had this awareness of how big and beautiful and majestic God was. Yesterday, I had the chance with our elders to stand on Bailey Peak and just look out over the vast and beautiful creation that God's woven together by his handiwork. Oh, whatever is lovely. Whatever. Think about it. One of my favorite organizations that I follow, so this is the Whatever's Just. One of the favorite organizations that I follow is a interfaith organization called Preemptive Love Coalition. And it's a group of doctors that got together, and they started to do work in areas that were attacked by ISIS. And they started to go in and they started to care for kids, and they have these 6 values that they hold. It's life-saving heart surgeries for children, emergency relief effort for families victimized by ISIS, empowering grants for small business owners, education for at-risk children, peacemaking in conflict zones, counsel to policymakers in Washington, D.C., Loveland, Baghdad, and beyond. That's whatever's just. I've followed them on Instagram, and every time I see one of their little pictures, I just pray, man, God, as you see these kids going in for surgeries in war zones that are going to save their life, you go, man, whatever's just. I'm for that. I'm not for Christian justice. I'm for justice, period. Because it's all God's. Here's a second organization. It's a group called Charity Water. And it was started by a guy named Scott Harrison a number of years ago. It's an interfaith organization, but this guy, Scott Harrison, is haunted by the fact that 663 million people still live in the world and have no access to clean drinking water. That's 10% of the world's population, roughly. And he goes, listen, the need for water is such a human need that it affects every single area of our life. So if we can get people clean drinking water, we can improve their health. We can give them more time to work. We can give them kids who are going and walking miles every day to get water. If we free them up, think of what their future might look like. And women that are doing the majority of the water gathering, what if they didn't have to walk for miles and miles and hours a day? What might their life start to look like? And he goes, we got to change that, man. Whatever is noble is God's. So think about it. Invest your time in it. Invest your energy in it. I think what Paul wants to do is say to a church that was getting bombarded by a world around them and had the tendency, probably because of that, to say we're going to get really ingrown and everything outside of us is evil and wrong and bad. Paul says, oh no. To that type of a church culture, he says, whatever is good is God's. So here's what I want to do. I want to end our time by going back to the Lord in worship. And I want to end this time by inviting you to do a little bit of whatevering. I want to remind you that when we stand firm in God, we experience the shalom of God, and that needs to be the foundation. But then I want to just invite us back to this idea of the world that we live in, as Dallas Willard says, is God-bathed. And how might we as the church become architects or excavators of the good? How might we start to see it and point it out and think about it and allow it to turn in us in such a way that it starts to change us? So Aaron graciously put together a short little video that's about whatever. And there's a whole lot of whatever around you. This is just an example. But as you watch it, will you think about the whatever that's around you and how you might turn it into worship?